I genuinely found the art and history of storytelling always fascinating through any medium because as a species, there's a lot of evidence coming out that we historically have always been storytellers. That there's some arguments that we formed society once we started doing medical intervention. I'd argue that when we started coming together around the campfire to tell stories, because we have a longer history as a species of lost oral and musical tradition. And the fact that storytelling and music are so old, we're talking maybe 30,000 years old, that we're finding records of people trying to tell stories in like proto instruments, that it's one of the defining things I think that makes us us, is telling stories and using it to define the space around us.
Do you love science fiction and fantasy books? You found yourself in the right dimension. Welcome to the greatest podcast in the multiverse, where each week I talk to science fiction and fantasy authors about myth, magic, and the infinite possibilities of storytelling. I'm your host, Herman Stuernagel, and I will be taking you on a journey with some of your favorite authors, helping you to get to know them and possibly uncover some new literary gems along the way. Ready to explore? Because on this show, every conversation is a doorway into a different world. So welcome once again to the greatest podcast in the multiverse. I'm super excited to have a very special guest today. Welcome here, R.R. Virdi.
Thanks for having me.
You're super welcome, Ronnie. Thank you for joining me. And why don't you just kick us off and tell us a little bit about who you are and your writing journey?
Sure. So, yeah, I was born and raised in Northern Virginia, Arlington, Virginia specifically. Grew up here most of my life, and I started writing at 18 with an eye towards self-publishing then, because by the time I got comfortable with my writing, self-publishing had just started taking off. There was a platform, I don't know if people are going to be familiar with this, called Smashwords. I think they're defunct now, and they were one of the earliest places you could self-publish, along with Amazon coming quickly after. And pretty soon off the bat, I think once the platform was there were immediate stories of the first people who went there, kind of like any platform, who became like millionaires overnight. Like self-publishing was now viable. And then a year later on Amazon, Hugh Howey and a lot of the first people were like blowing up. And I looked at it as kind of urban fantasy was dead at that time traditionally. No one was acquiring it from editors I spoke to in person. They sort of already had like their log list, similar to what we're seeing right now with Romantasy and Cozy going through a huge boom. Urban fantasy was on the tail end of that. They'd already bought everyone like 5 to 6 years earlier. And I was like, why don't I just self-publish the urban fantasy I want? Because I can get the books out, take my time to improve, and no one can say no, and I'm not sitting on a manuscript. And I kind of just started from there, and it slowly just started picking up and leading me down to the path I'm on now.
Okay, really cool. Yeah, I think Smashwords is still around. I think Drafted Digital bought them out a year or two ago.
Okay.
Yeah, but they're definitely not what they used to be back in the early days, right? Yeah. So have you always been a writer? Is that something you've always been doing?
Yes and no, not in the traditional sense of novelist. That started at 18. Prior to that, I did actually used to write songs, and I wrote poetry throughout middle school to college.
Okay.
That's actually what I started with, and I didn't ever consider really being a writer because a lot of this has to do with obviously the Asiatic background. It was impressed upon me from a very early age, the traditional doctor, lawyer, engineer. And I thought I was going to be a lawyer because I was like, I can argue pretty well. I don't have the brain power for like the medical side or the math with engineering. I was like, it's not happening. And then I got to college. I was like, I'm not going to be a lawyer either, am I? So.
Okay. So then at what point did you decide that writing was the direction you wanted to go?
So this was summer when I was 18, going into college, and I didn't really know what I wanted to do with my life. Like lawyers seemed like that, but it was definitely in my mind already becoming a backup plan. And I just finished reading the new novel by a really famous fantasy novelist at the time who killed off a lot of his characters. It's not George R. R. Martin. In fact, the whole shocking part of this was an author who worked up to the 90s, built fantasy as I knew it for a very long time, and was famous for not killing off the characters. It was a whole like classic sword and sorcery. The hero's always good. They always survive somehow. They make it throughout in the day. Very tropey. And none of these are critiques. I love their work. I still love them to this day. They're one of my favorite authors. But when I read that, I was like, this is not how you write a fantasy book. You can't kill the main characters. This guy has no idea what he's doing. I can do it better. So it's like, why don't we just start writing one? And me and my best friend sat down to start writing the most god-awful fantasy that has ever existed. But I fell in love with the process. And while doing it, I saw myself by chapter 12 getting better because I was Googling and learning and looking at authors and like, what am I doing wrong so far? Why am I not connecting with my story as much? And I loved the process, and it immediately came to me like, this is a craft. It doesn't matter where you start. Someone might have more initial talent, but if you stick with it, you will get better. And I kind of signed on to myself that I'm going to stick with this no matter what, because like at the very end, I'll keep getting better. Like that much I know. I don't know how fast and to what degree, but I'll keep getting better.
Right. Okay. Very cool. Yeah. And so, I mean, for those who are maybe listening and don't know who you are, I mean, you are the author of the first binding, USA Today bestselling author. Now, Now you self-published a few books before the first binding. How many had you written before this
Ooh.
one?
So, grave beginnings, grave measures, dangerous ways, grave dealings, grave tidings, Star Shepherd, Goblin King, Beast Queen, and I'm forgetting another because I think there was 10. And then
Okay.
the first binding, The Doors of Midnight, and I have a thriller that's written under a pen name that's on submission right now with my agent. So
Okay.
before that, at least 9 to 10, and then after like another 3 or 4.
Right. Okay. So, I mean, so you had a good number of novels under your belt. Now, is the first binding your first trad pub book?
Yeah. Yes. Yes. Yes.
Okay. And so what was the process like? I guess what made you decide to go from indie to trad pub, and I guess a little bit of what that process looked like for you.
So believe it or not, I originally wasn't. This was intended to be a self-published series that was probably going to be on Patreon episode by episode because it's
Oh,
picaresque, and I wanted to write like a long journey similar to what I guess most analogous people would see with One Piece, where while there is a meta plot, there is a series of arcs, and it's a giant adventure story, which is some of my favorite.
yeah.
You go back to Treasure Island, the Odyssey. They all have different other complex plot structures within them, but they can also be argued that they're the grand adventure story, and I've always loved that. And so I thought this was going to be written in that way. And at the time, Audible and Tantor had audio interest in it. They thought this would be really cool as like a serialized audio or compilations after having enough chapters done, right?
Right.
And I was up for the Nebula that year along with my co-author, a brilliant Sri Lankan author named Yuthunjaya Wijaratne. So we went there, and agents started like talking to us about, hey, what do you have next? What's going on? And I told them about the first binding. It wasn't called that at that time. It was just Tales of Tremaine, the series name, because I didn't know I was going
Okay.
to break it into books.
Right.
And I was like, yeah, the first act, which essentially is book one, was going to be like 350,000 words. I knew that. And every agent was like, yeah, sorry, no, you're wasting our time. I was like, oh. They're like, yeah, no one's going to publish that. It's too big. And then one agent in this crowd, like the second or third day, parted all the other agents like he was parting the Red Sea, wearing this giant red suit, like red everything, red pants, red socks, red shoes. And he's like, yeah, I've been hearing a lot about you and this project you've got. You want to tell me about it? And I was like, you're probably not interested. And he's like, why is that? And I told him that everyone's saying it's too big. I'm like, you're not going to be able to publish it, and it's fine. Like, I'm probably going to self-publish it. And he goes, well, I published Brandon Sanderson's Stormlight, so I could probably get that published. And I was like, oh, okay. Uh, Send him a sample, and then he's like, I don't really read books first. I read your short stories. See if I like you. I'll send me your short stories. It's like, okay, cool. Send it to him. Didn't hear back for most of the year. And then I'm at another convention where I'm talking to a tabletop RPG editor who had another editor at the table that I didn't know was an editor. Like, just a friend come by. We're talking fantasy and just geeking out. And then the other guy is like, hey, are you working on something right now? I was like, yeah, Tales of Tremaine. I think I might turn it into a book now, the first one. And I told him about all my inspirations, and he loved the sound of it. And he's like, send it to me. And I asked him why, and he was like, well, I'm a tour editor. If I like this, I'll buy the book. And I was like, okay. I didn't really think much because the agent had vanished too.
Right.
Month and a half later, I get a phone call saying like, hey, we need to have a phone call, like a longer one, where you're sitting down and you're ready to make a business decision. I was like, why? He's like, I showed the president of Tor your book. She loved it. We love it. We want to buy the first 3. Do you have an agent? And I was like, no. He's like, go get one. So I went back to the agent who never responded, and I asked him what was going on. He's like, oh, I didn't read your book. I read one short story, didn't like it. So he ghosted me, and then he started reading the book. He's like, oh, I actually like this. He's like, I've never liked a book that starts in a tavern before, but I like yours. And I was like,
Oh wow.
thanks.
Yeah.
And then signed on with him, and then a few months later, because this was the holidays, so Tor had shut down then officially. So we waited till they opened back up after the whole holiday closing vacation time. They came back with the contract for the first 3. But I never anticipated that. I thought this was going to be self-published.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And it's definitely. I mean, it sounds like something. It kind of you kind of fell into trad pop is kind
Yeah,
of what it
yeah.
sounds like, right? Yeah, that's really cool. Um, so I guess I was going to ask you, what advice do you have for writers that might be seeking a trad pub deal, but it sounds like you were kind of in the right place
Ooh.
at the right time. But do you have any
I
other,
think
any
I
tips?
think honestly that's part of it, and I hate saying that, but right now
Yeah,
we're seeing a lot of like something I've learned and I've had people say is traditional doesn't set trends, it chases them. Because it has more money to do this. So, like when Hunger Games blew up, we had the whole dystopian YA trend immediately follow that.
yeah,
Urban fantasy, right now, cozy and romantasy. Um, I would say first, definitely just write the book you love. You have to because you will never ever be able to predict the trends in traditional. Indie, you can probably do that. You have a lot more time and lead space to pivot and self-publish a book quicker. Traditional, when you're being bought, you're bought with the idea that you're going to be 1 to 2 years out because you've probably already bought the catalog for this year that's releasing. Editing timelines, industry going through so many changes, paper print crisis. It definitely be a lesson of perseverance and don't take any one person's advice as prescriptive because I've seen people break in a million ways they didn't expect because it honestly seems, this is a joke, but it feels true, that when someone gets into traditional, they find out how that person did it and then they close that door. So you have to find another
mm.
way in. It's super weird. It's not the best advice, but I feel like it's honest. It's just be willing to
Yeah,
persevere because you never know how you're going to get in. I never really cared that much because I was fortunate enough to be mentored by traditional authors, and they were telling me some of the stuff that was going on even before I came in. And booktubers and reviewers who are tangentially connected to authors might have heard some of these stories before too, so they're aware that there have been a lot of industry shifts, acquisition shifts, the industry is going through different changes, self-publishing offering more opportunities, and I think I just honestly fell through the cracks.
okay. No, hey, and that's good advice to hear, and I think too, like I ask mainly because most of my authors that I interview are self pub. I
Mm-hmm.
have, I've had a few trad pub, but especially from going, from self pub to trad pub. I mean, that's definitely you kind of have seen both sides of how things work now, so it's kind of good to hear that perspective.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And honestly, with the way things are, I definitely still advocate indie a lot more than traditional. I'm not sure if I
Hmm.
should say that, but there's a lot of stuff going on in the industry that you're never going to have control over. And I know one of the big critiques of self-publishing is you have to market a lot, but if you follow most authors online on Twitter now, that you have to do that traditional too. Even if you get a big deal, I mean, like six-figure lead authors I know have to do all their own marketing for the most part. I mean, they'll get some free stuff like you'll get Twitter supports and banners and mailing list stuff, but that's about it. That's not
Yeah,
brand
right.
building.
Yeah, for sure. And like from what from what I've seen, and I mean, obviously, correct me if I'm wrong, but like, I mean, it's easier for trad pub authors to maybe get into the brick and mortar stores,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe get maybe do a book tours and that sort of thing physically, but otherwise, you're doing a lot of the virtual marketing. And I mean, I've seen, I don't know if our listeners have seen your book tour for the Doors of Midnight, but you've got, I mean, pages of
Yeah,
of interviews that you're doing, and that, I mean, you all arranged yourself, and I mean, I know
yeah,
Adrian helped you with that as well, but it's
absolutely.
not like Tor set that up for you.
Yep. Yeah, and that's actually what I was going to say. The first book's success seemed to be very much because of people like you. The actual booktube reviewer and reader community has, it goes back to word of mouth, right? There's just a new form of it, but it has genuinely been people engagement that has made book one so successful and hopefully book two. But like you said, that's something you can organize even self-published. It's going to take a lot. I don't want to say a lot of work. It might just take a lot of outreach, which is different. Going into it knowing that, because Ryan Cahill's talked about that and how booktubers are super kind to first check out his first book and spotlight him, and that's really what I think it comes down to. But you have to do that regardless.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So now you also shifted. I mean, not only shifted from indie to trad pub, but you shifted kind of genres a little bit as
Mm-hmm.
well. Was it just is it something that you plan to do and write in a wide variety of sub fantasy genre, or what was the, I guess, why did you go from urban fantasy to more of an, is it epic fantasy? Would you consider first writing epic
That's the
fantasy, or?
weird thing, because like it's being branded as epic fantasy, but when I first pitched it, it was kind of more in the vein of Tolkien in that it's a mythic fantasy. In that, while it's not analogous 100% to Lord of the Rings, but my inspirations are a lot of the classic epic myths that I'm not retelling, but this is a love letter to a lot of the epic poems and beats and tropes from classic fantasy that I think people only know one side of the story of. Like a lot of the stuff I've been tweeting about recently has been compared to myths of like the Dragon Slayer myth, and most people know like the Norse version, but they don't know there's an exactly similar South Asian version. There's also a
Right.
Balkan and Baltic version. Um, and this was, I don't want to say to decolonize fiction because that gets very aggressive. It was more to show along the fictional Silk Road, like there's so many countries, and because they've all traded from way earlier than I guess the average person thinks about or knows about, they also traded stories, beats, myths, and religions. And a lot of
Mm,
things were co-opted and readopted to form like new characters and heroes within different cultures that are analogous and similar to others. And then over time, you dial that up, and you have a lot of fantasy tropes and poems that are Celtic, Scottish, German, that are all very similar. But people don't know
right.
the Asiatic side of it, so this
Yeah.
came about like more like I'm taking myths and classic fantasy tropes and doing them through a South Asian lens to re-show that like these all exist in other places. Now you're seeing it through like an Asian hero's journey almost, with
Right.
more of the beats that were taken away from the hero's journey. Um, but that I think was too complicated and annoying for them to sell an easy copy to. So like it's epic fantasy, and I was like, it's more mythic because you're going to see a lot of nods to different myths and tropes. Okay, and I get it. I do get it. Like all what I just said too is not very condensed marketable, right? There's a term
Right.
in publishing in Hollywood that's called high concept, and
Yeah.
what that means is not super unique. It's super easy to digest. Like
Right.
it has the highest chance of hitting every demographic. Um, and yeah, my example was not that right now.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, it's kind of the tweet version of what your story is, trying to reach
Yes,
the most number of, potential readers for it, right?
yes, yes, yes.
Yeah. I want to dig into the concept of storytelling a little bit more. Both, I want to dig into more about what you just said, but I also want to get into more of your motivation behind storytelling, because really, the first binding, I mean, it's about a storyteller. It's about storytelling. What is your motivation behind storytelling, and why is this such a concept and theme that you wanted to delve into within the first binding?
Wow. So there's the immediate of like when I was researching stuff for it, I genuinely found the art and history of storytelling always fascinating through any medium because as a species, there's a lot of evidence coming out that we historically have always been storytellers. That there's some arguments that we formed society once we started doing medical intervention, that we started helping like someone who got hurt. I'd argue that it's when we started coming together around the campfire to tell stories, because we have a longer history as a species of lost oral and musical tradition than so many other things. Um, and the fact that storytelling and music are so old, we're talking maybe 30,000 years old, that we're finding records of people trying to tell stories in like proto instruments, that it's one of the defining things I think that makes us is telling stories and using it to define the space around us, whether it's why do lightning storms happen and then a god and then the story of that god and the story of those other gods and they relate and then we trade and translate those. There are so many comparative gods in mythology that are almost the exact same as others. One of the most famous ones is Deus Peter, which is Proto-Indo-European, and he evolved into Deus Peter in South Asia. He is the origin of Zeus because Zeus is not really a name; it's Zeus Peter, which is another sky father. Zeus came from Deus Peter, and a truncation of that from Deus Peter is Jupiter, which is Jupiter. So you have that god, and then you also have the phrase Deus Volt, but Deus comes from the Proto-Indo-European sky god Deus. So you see, like a similar god has almost been co-opted by a lot of the world, and over time truncated and his attributes made into one of the most popular gods in history. And when I saw all this with storytelling and my own comparative mythology research, I realized like that's all we've been really doing at the end of the day. We're still retelling reductions or comparable versions or co-opted versions of very similar stories at a grand scale, which made me feel like this is one of the most human-centric things I could do is focus on storytelling. Why is it important? Why does it travel? And then Ari sort of serves the lens as like a proto-hero to examine that through. No different than like Odysseus or Gilgamesh or any other famous legendary hero. There are analogs of them in other cultures. A great example is if you Google Mahabharata and Ramayana, or Ramayana in English, to the Iliad and the Odyssey, people have already done entirely scholarly breakdowns of the similar beats, motifs, tropes, scene by scenes in some cases. And it does paint a picture of like we traded a lot of story culturally. That is the story of us, is taking other stories and just going, I want to put my spin on it.
Yeah, right. And I think, I mean, you mentioned Gilgamesh too. Like, I mean, you see, a flood myth in every
Yeah,
culture that we can remember essentially. And that, I mean, I think goes to show that those stories get get shared and traded around like that. Now, I mean, you said this is something that's always interested you. How much research do you kind of do into that?
Uh, a lot. So when I wake up, I now that I've had more time to do more of the research I want. When I usually wake up around 7:30, the first thing I do is I'll queue up like maybe an hour and a half of different YouTube videos or lectures or academic ones. For people who don't know, there's a lot of stuff you can get free from the local library and audio on this subject. There's a lot of really great educational stuff. I try to email specifically comparative mythology scholars because they can give you their papers for free because the academic journals sell them and they don't get the money anyways, which is terrible. So they
Right.
just give you that. And I try
Okay.
to do that when I wake up every morning before I do more fiction reading
Wow.
uh, for fun. It's more like a mental warm up of how to take myths and then encapsulate them in my mind and let them, sit around while I also go to just read and practice from fiction. Um, and it just works for me doing it better in the morning because then I think after I read fiction, I'm always thinking of how I can interpret that myth and respin that. Because
Hmm.
essentially what Tolkien did with the Finnish Kalevala, the Norse, the Eddas that he used, the Anglo-Saxon poems like Beowulf, he took that and he sort of encapsulated it and made it very British through his lens and his experiences, and sort of created a new British mythology because at that time it was very Arthurian dominated, and he came out with sort of a new British legacy. And my inspiration is sort of doing the same of not the goal. I don't think I get to choose if I get to make a new South Asian canon, but the idea of he used myths and he loved the idea of reinterpreting through them through certain lenses. I can at least structurally do that.
Right.
So right now there's been a lot of more study on the history of the Silk Road, Proto-Indo-European, and then what was traded that wasn't the hard goods. I do follow that, but I wanted to follow more of the cultural aspects because there's a great history of how Buddhism shaped so much of the world because it was the most popular religion for a while for other Asiatic countries to adopt. So as Buddhism traveled from India, you see Vedic and then later Hindu practices travel with it, and then through that the mythology and stories. So Indra, for example, the Vedic storm god, is actually known and worshipped in Japan. Now it's very rural worship, like he's not worshipped like as a very popular deity, but he canonically exists by the same name in Japan, and it was because Buddhism introduced him there when Buddhism took root. So I started realizing and following down this other rabbit hole of like storytelling also traveled with religion and other larger components of life, and there wasn't any place it didn't touch on.
Cool. There's so much there.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. That's okay. I'll pull out some threads here. But let's talk about you bringing in that the South Asian mythology into your writing, because obviously that was very important to you. Can you talk a little bit about that and your process behind that, as well as I guess, yeah, maybe some specifics about what you brought into the story.
Sure. So I most people are going to be familiar with, like, I guess if they think of Indian mythology, Hinduism, but that's not the only religion and aspect that came out of there. There was also obviously Buddhism, Sikhism, Islam has had a huge presence in India for a very long time because of Mughal and previous incursions and conquest. And then there's also Vedic, which is the Vedism is the older religion that Hinduism was birthed out of, and a lot of the original epics come out of the time period of the Vedas and the Vedic time period. And there are certain different changes from mantles, interpretations as you go through that period. And I actually wanted a more Vedic take of South Asia. So think of it almost as like, this is a very bad reduction, but if you look at fantasy and you have like a golden age, like that's supposed to be older than all the others, and it's like the source progenitor of a lot of the myths. I went there and then Proto-Indo-European because I also, like I talked about the comparative mythology aspects, there's a lot of similarities between Greco-Roman myths to South Asian, Norse myths to South Asian, and then obviously things birthed out of the Indo-Iranian, so Zoroastrianism as well. And I want to sort of use that and then dial it back to South Asia through what I personally knew really well I could culturally represent, and then kind of cast a wider eye out over the Silk Road of like incorporating certain things from different cultures that are similar and I might be able to talk about in this, but then also still, I suppose, accessible to the reader.
Yeah, right.
And one aspect of that would be in book one, I make the point to do a nesting story of a cosmogony story, like the beginning of the universe. And it seems very similar to Genesis, but that's actually also very similar to the Norse creation story, as well as the South Asian one. It's particularly in this case of a cosmic egg and like this cosmic heat, which now scientists actually say that the universe might have been born that way, of like this cosmic expanding heat But the
Okay.
cosmic egg theory exists in South Asia, some Chinese myths of like a heavenly pearl at first, and I use those specific kennings and those specific styles of words throughout that narrative.
Hmm.
And in here, what I did take from South Asian culture, but I sort of changed a little, was the creator deity in here is called Brahm. Now, in South Asian mythology, it is Brahma. There's the extra A at the end, and also he's a different kind of god as a creator god, whereas I've kept mine a solar deity specifically. The reason for that choice is solar deity historically has played a really good role in South Asian mythology, but it's one that's analogous in almost every culture, as at one point had a preeminent solar deity. So if I was going to do the comparative aspect, I figured it important to keep it there.
Okay.
And the other reason is that there is a South Asian mythology nod later that mirrors other myths as well. But it is, I don't know if you've gotten there, a story about a virginal birth, a son of a son or of himself.
Yeah.
And in here, it's that same solar deity. Now, for some people, it's the Christ story when they read it, but it's also Surya and Kunti, which is a South Asian story of a solar deity who gives a princess a boon. And through that boon, it's a virginal birth of her son. However, there's also the story in this virginal birth where she's sort of ashamed of still having given birth out of wedlock. So she
Okay.
sends this prince downriver in a basket, which for people who are familiar, that there's a nod to the Moses thing, and these are older
Right.
stories. But the
Yeah.
virginal birth story actually exists in a lot of other cultures. So a lot of the nesting stories or Ari's heroic beats are things either from existing fantasy novels that show up in more than one novel, so I could do the commentary on that, or they exist in terms of like a wider mythology of other cultures, so I can address that and then show it through, in this case, just a South Asian lens. So it's the idea of virginal birth, but I'm going to do it in a South Asian way. So there's other themes, not just the locale, but there's other themes of judgment, of societal valuation, and then obviously the wording and language I might choose to associate with that and how I go about it.
Right. That's all so incredibly fascinating, and I wish I was more learned on on a lot of that, so I could have a more intelligent conversation about all that. But I find it incredibly fascinating. But like I do want to talk about your first. When did you first conceptualize, I guess, bringing the story to life
Oh,
in
okay.
this way? And how did you integrate? Like, how did you? I guess, yeah. Talk to me about the ideation of the series, and how things progressed from there for you.
Okay. So I was originally drafting this very loose standalone fantasy novel that was, I guess, somewhat familiar to the first binding in that it was going to be another character who had a series of legends. Only his were much shorter, or done over a shorter period of time, and it was a sort of a social revolution book. He was going to comment on certain themes of stuff I was working on. I guess it'd be almost like Count of Monte Cristo meets V for Vendetta, but focusing on sort of POC fantastical issues I wanted to, and themes of colonization. And the storyteller was going to be a side character in this story, who the main protagonist would meet. And he has his own fantastic thing. It was just supposed to be this really captivating character that sort of let me talk about storytelling, but he was also going to serve a function of sort of getting bits of this other guy's story as like little vignettes. The audience was still going to be told it, framed narrative, just I wanted the character. And the more I developed the storyteller, he sort of took on his own entire much like Ari flamboyant persona that like dominated the narrative in my mind. So I was like,
Mm.
I'm going to shelve this idea for a while. I'm going to go work with the storyteller, and it kind of everything I wanted to do kind of started unfolding around him specifically. And then it became this giant vehicle of I wanted to do a wandering storyteller picaresque because at this time I already was aware of Ibn Fadlan, who was like the Marco Polo before Marco Polo. He
Mm.
journeyed from the Middle East as far as to Russia, and he
Okay.
actually brought a storyteller with him. So he was a merchant who wanted to sort of trade and travel and get goods from all over the world, obviously to enrich yourself. And he met kings and Vikings and Russian czars. And the reason he brought a storyteller with him was is if they were kind of like the early fantasy rock stars, along with just musical bards.
Right.
And if you bring one with you, they get to perform. They can break the ice. They can regale people you're with like their travels and make it sound really cool, which makes them maybe more amenable to hosting you or wanting to trade with you, which goes back to the financial aspect. And I was like, why don't I just actually do the storyteller? And then if I do, it lets me do some really cool stuff I want to do with meta narrative stuff, meta reflection, meta commentary, meta referential, and then I get to have him use storytelling techniques to tell the story. I can really go hard because I genuinely actually love the craft aspect of that. I get to do certain epic poems. I get to do certain rhyme schemes of couplets and quatrains. I can make this a very lyrical story, which that appealed just to me for what I wanted to do.
Yeah.
Personal
Right.
note.
Yeah, and that ties in. I mean, you mentioned that you did a lot of poetry and songwriting and that sort of thing, kind of in high school, and that so that kind of gives you
Yeah,
the avenue to do that, right? Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
and so that's kind of, I guess, where Ari comes in, where he's kind of, kind of that rock star in the sense that you mentioned. But you've also introduced kind of a magic system into the process that you've given him. Why did you make it? Why did you do that as well, and making the storytelling a magical experience?
Well, so there's a couple layers. One, I
Yeah,
genuinely just enjoy that. So there's the personal satisfaction of that.
yeah, no, that's fantastic.
I was a point in a time where I generally fell so much in love with the idea of words and how they sound because of other research I was doing just for music theory, for diphthong, reading scansion, and how certain pacing and stuff affects the musicality of words. Um, and then there was the aspect of just South Asian history, and it's not known, but was always extremely musical and lyrical. So our epics are epic poems, and predominantly they're written actually in rhyming couplets or quatrains. Some also have the use of, I'm not sure what the South Asian equivalent of this is, but for lack of purpose, caesura, the exact same pauses that change how you read a poem, you read a line, and inflect certain pauses to get different tonal outcomes. And it just made sense that if they were all epic poems and I wanted the South Asiatic lens, I should do this for the point of oral performance for oral pleasure. Like there should be an aspect that it should be beautiful to just listen and read to, which
Right.
it does make mean it might be a harder read for some people, unfortunately, which means I might lose a market segment by writing it that way. But I genuinely believed I would also find the readers who really wanted that particular aspect of that rather than curtailing
Right.
it. It might have maybe had a little bit more mainstream, I don't know, accessibility if I changed the prose style, but I think it would have lost what also drew, I guess, the most eager fans to it.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. And I think it translates really well into an audio format the way that you've done it, because um, it might be hard for some readers to translate that um, lyricalness of it in their heads, but to hear it being read in that way, I think translates really well.
That was the hope,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
That's essentially how I wrote it. I didn't speak it aloud all the time. I would go back and speak sections aloud once I'd written them to see if they had the same cadence that I had in my head when I was doing that. But it was meant to be, yeah, performed that way.
love that. I love it so much. Now, did you have the whole series planned out when you started writing it?
Yes and no. So I'm a pantser, but I follow a tradition of something Tim Butcher taught me, which is a spook situation, protagonist, objective, obstacle, climax, and I did have that for the whole series. I do know like
Okay.
what's Ari's actual main mission. Who is he? I knew most of the details of his epic legends that you don't see yet in the books, like his past as it unfolds, like the key high points. And I'm writing towards fulfilling those for the emotional catharsis, because once you promise them, the point is sort of to fulfill them on an epic character journey like story or picaresque. And I had obviously his obstacles. I know every detail about the Ashura. I know every detail about other things he's going to encounter and what the big final objective he has to finally do in the final acts of the books is. And I know the final climax. And I do actually have the last page and a half written.
Oh wow, nice.
The actual ending of the story is written because it came to me one day before I actually started like the full project. I was like, okay, I know this ends. I might change words. I might get better, obviously, by then, but the actual content is not going to change. And then from that point, I've been doing what there's actually a great breakdown of this for anyone listening on Brandon Sanderson's blog about Robert Jordan's process, who was also a pantser. But what he did know was he knew certain key points he was going to do, and he'd established them early on in certain parts of the books, knowing that this is going to bridge to this, and then everything else. As I do that, you sort of narrow the field of how you can get there, because as you commit to stuff in each book, you are narrowing the road of these things have been done. These are commitments I've made. I must fulfill X, Y, Z here, here, and here. And you're constantly narrowing your scope, which even as a pantser, it's kind of like a reverse outline. Like you are sort of creating structure as you go, as long as you bother to adhere to it.
Yeah, you have the destination and
Yeah.
waypoints in mind as you're writing. Yeah, and I think from what I remember, Brandon Sanderson saying that Robert Jordan had the end written, or at least like
Yeah.
the most of it written. So
Yeah.
so like he kind of knew where the story had to end up.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, cool. And we talked, getting back, I guess, to the lyricism just a bit. I know we're jumping around a bit, but that
Mhm.
just reminded me of our conversation that we had a little bit before we hit record. You said that you handwrite out some of those, some of your scenes.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah,
So some of my favorite scenes, probably the most lyrical ones, I actually take the time to handwrite those out. One exercise I do, especially for a character driven series, especially one that's predominantly first person, is I will actually do little vignettes and monologues in Ari's voice about anything. So yesterday, I actually in the backyard. It's summer, right? So I spent about 30 minutes writing like how do I describe the color green without saying the color green. So I would reference like like the full flush of bright spring. um, you would reference like the brightness and promise of like fresh blooming trees. You could say all these different things, and people know that they associate the color green with that, especially in summer, without saying the word green ever. So you can paint a
right,
color that way. Am I ever going to use that? Maybe not. But I might take something from that and do that because Ari has those lines. He performs in that way. And I've done that for a lot of different things, for color descriptions in a few scenes where it's really beautiful, or a certain epic passage. I will write out a lot of these moments just by hand, as just a character exercise. And a lot of times they're really, really good. It's like, I will keep that. Because there's some neuroscience studies that actually show you're actually more creative writing longhand or after taking a short walk.
right.
Like I think that's a 10-minute walk, and there's a massive boost in creativity. So as a writer, I'm
Yeah.
like, why not just practice writing and then doing it by longhand if that helps? And for me, it does help.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and that really fascinates me. And I do have some writer friends that do write their first draft out in longhand. And as you were saying, then when they go to type it all out or dictate it, however they enter it into the computer after, I mean, they're able to refine
It's a revision. Yeah.
and it's a revision. I would find that process incredibly tiresome. As I mentioned, I wouldn't be able to read my half of what I had written, and I would really struggle with that. But I think it's impressive, for sure. And I know you said that you don't do all of your writing like that,
Yeah. Yeah.
um, because obviously writing, I mean, an 800-page book would be a lot of strain on your on your wrist. I
Yes.
think
Yes.
writing it all
Yes.
at
Yes. Yeah.
longhand.
Yeah.
Yeah,
The
yeah,
things I predominantly do, like yesterday, I stayed up. I was writing um, loose notes and myths instead that I was going to use as base inspiration for some more nesting stories, like in book three. I did write out like different iterations of the opening, small subtle stuff I wanted to do for book three. I did write out. This is older though. This bit, but this was January this year. I have a really big climactic scene in book three. That's actually already done, written out by hand. So it's out of order, but I know where it goes. I know the sequence it follows. So when I get there, that's going to be mostly transcribing that. It saves it, but it would be far better had I written that key point because of the lyricism of the novel. I can refine that so when I get there, it's not just a climax of the actual scene. It's also just really beautiful to read that. So there's like a high point note in the language style I use, which I want to.
yeah. Well, and how quickly do you write? Because I mean, these aren't short books. Like, what's kind of your output in a given day?
Uh, if I'm dedicated to just this, I could turn one of these around in a year. I actually wrote
Okay.
book two in 8 months, which was faster than book one. Book two's original draft was 450,000 words.
Wow.
It was cut down to 385 for print purposes.
Wow.
But book one took about a year. If I go by word count, there was a period of time where December 2021 to January 2022. Yeah, that's about right. December to January. I was doing 3 to 4,000 words a day on book two.
Wow.
So I had almost like 200,000 done by end of January. A good chunk of book two, nearly half, was done in 2 months. But I was also machine gunning it. Like I was writing morning to night,
Okay.
in big bursts. Because some days it would take 6 to 8 hours to get that number, and other days I'd
Right.
get it like an hour and a half, and then I'd do another 30 minutes at night. And it's like, okay, cool. But I was aiming by word count. There were
Right.
definitely days I had a few 6,000 word days, but those are very rare.
Yeah. Right.
Commonly, I know where those happen. Those are usually my nesting stories, because I really
Okay.
love the mythology so much, and I'm always
Mm.
thinking about it in the back of my head. I know, like the second I get to them, there's some weird switch that flips. It's like I know how to write this. Like I've been thinking about this myth
Yeah.
forever. I know how much of the world building, what the interpretation of this world is, and I just crank it out, and I have so much fun writing those out. Those are an absolute
Yeah.
blast. My
Right.
safe average when I was doing urban fantasy that I feel comfortable with and I like for sanity is about 2,000 words a day, which I think is a really healthy normal. I see a lot of writers clocking in around that.
Yeah, that seems to be about, I mean, average if someone's able to rate, full time or whatnot, right?
Yeah.
But I mean, but then you've got to edit these big books as well, so you've got to spend time doing that. So I'm really impressed that you're able to write these big books and that
Thank
the
you.
speed that you're able to do. Now, how did your process for book two change from book one?
Ooh. So I think the biggest thing was, this is weird. And this is an anal fear, but there's always that thing of like book two, like has the second book syndrome, the sophomore slump. I actually started going and reading up like every second movie I ever like liked in a trilogy, and I was studying the ones that were better, and then the ones that were like not regarded as highly. And I was trying to find out the psychological reason of why. And so this was less. Well, this is I suppose still craft, but it's an emotional craft of intuiting stuff.
Yeah,
Um, a lot of ones that failed or were not as good as book one were they either failed to fulfill some promise introduced in the first story, didn't capitalize on it, and you already lose the sense of newness in a lot of twos, right? You already
right,
introduced the world and everything. It's like, what could I do and keep in mind for my second story that hopefully like capitalizes on what I need to, but also if I can find ways to keep the newness, if I can find ways to ratchet stuff up within the context of the story I want to tell. So I focused a lot more actually on that. A lot of societal input of like why don't book twos usually score as high? Because one that did and surpassed book one was The Great Hunt by
okay,
Robert Jordan. It's regarded
yeah,
more often than not as better than book one, and I think a
right,
lot of that had to do with like it's a travelogue, it's a journey. You get to see more of the new world.
yeah,
There's a bigger climax for Rand in it, where now he fights one of the Forsaken, and like it's a giant battle in the sky. So there's a coolness factor. There's a paying off escalation of his journey to become known as the Dragon Reborn. And I was like, okay, I understand the actual psychological components of these beats and the story structure in terms of why people liked it more. So I
right.
tried to just incorporate that mentally in what I'm doing with my story. What's the best way to execute it for book two? And thankfully, so far, the early reviews from reviewers and stuff like Fantasy Book Critic all seem to agree it's vastly superior to book one. So I'm happy with that. It seems like it's worked out.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, I really love that approach because you didn't. I mean, you went in with a lot of intention to find out, what's going to set this book apart and how is it going to resonate with readers in a way that won't land flat. For that often happens
Yeah.
with book two. So I think that's fantastic. Now, I saw that you mentioned on social media that the reception for this has been really good. And what I guess what has been different about how the approach has been to this book as opposed to other book twos where it has gotten some more attention from either the publisher or other readers that perhaps doesn't always happen.
Oh, that's a good question. So I think with traditional publishing, this is something I already knew, and it's sort of been the case. Is book twos don't usually get a lot of support, unfortunately, because I think they're counting on books two to sell just book one, and they have an expected drop off, which is disappointing. However, the reader and bookstore side seems to be really good because what I learned, and I didn't know this before, was if a book one does really well, specific stores that had it do well will usually commit to more with book two because they want that buy through. They want the new book launch of book two to do really well. They know it's going to go back and sell issues of book one.
Right.
So that's been really cool. And now I think it's slowly been building a fan base. Unfortunately, because of like publishing stuff and delays, the books are coming out 2 years apart now instead of a year apart. I think it works out though because people are still finding book one. It's a big read. And book one came out at the tail end of the first COVID wave in 2022 when COVID was just like we were just finally starting to get adjusted to it and conventions were opening back up. So I
Yeah.
think it's seen this like slow reader word of mouth swell because it's been doing
Right.
better in weekly sales for book one, I think,
Mhm.
because of book two's interest. Bookstores have been wanting to partner up now to do signings, which that one's new. That didn't really
Okay.
happen too much on launch of book one. There was
Right.
some of that for the paperback of book one a year later, but like now there's a lot more like I want to say on the reader, reviewer, and the brick and mortar side of things, like the actual sales points. There's been a lot more interest and support there, which has been really nice to get used to. But it's also a organizational, I guess, hurdle for me. I have to admit I'm not really good at like managing like interview and blog schedule stuff. That's a complete like flaw of mine. So it's been like a lot
Okay.
of Excel document and like Google Alert notes of like how do I manage my own
Right.
tour now.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, and I have to say, like, I have been seeing I've been seeing the first binding all over the place on social media lately. So obviously, the push for book two has been driving a lot more readers to book one. From my perspective at least, seeing bookstagrammers and booktubers and that online.
Oh, that's
So
great.
that's
That's good to know. But yeah,
yeah,
that's why, like I said, like I think a lot of this, and I give gratitude and thanks to people like you and the actual the consumer side of this, because from what I've seen, that seems to be what's been the driving force behind the book's success so far. Has been genuinely just readers and really kind bloggers and booktubers and Instagrammers. Because there's so much forms of content creation. I apologize, I don't know like the whole breadth of it, but it's just gotten a lot of just word of mouth, real people support.
Yeah, and I feel like that is what is driving book sales these days. Is kind of that word of mouth, online word of mouth, um, um, viral support and that sort of thing of different books. So that's really cool to see. Now, what can you tell us about the Doors of Midnight without, I guess, giving too many spoilers or any spoilers away for it? Like, what can you tell
Sure.
us, I guess, about it? Yeah.
Uh, so story wise, both the present and past pick up pretty immediately where book one leaves off. The only difference is in the past, there's like a few weeks of like a winter break for Ari, and I intentionally wrote it that way. It's almost like a school holiday break. He's still at school, but like 2-3 weeks have sort of passed and mellowed out from the consequences of book one, and it's immediately picking up with what happens at the end of the present day, where he's also facing other consequences, not to spoil things, and him having to navigate a sort of foreign court system, with a lot of backstabbing politics. Unfortunately, they're going through an election for essentially a prince who is supposed to succeed into kingship. They have sort of a minor democratic system in terms of at least voting. The oldest does not inherit in the society, but every male heir is sort of up, and there has to be sort of a political appointment to which prince ascends to becoming king. And Ari got caught in the middle of this dangerous game during that election, and sort of has to clear his name for something that he was framed for in the present day. So you're going to go through a lot of that while he narrates, of course, his story to the singer Eloine, about what happened in his past that continues to lead up to this point of why he's become this great legend in the present and what he's really looking for. Like, he's on a mission, clearly, vengeance, but he's also looking for a very particular story, he continually states in the present day. But he's also on a mission to kill a prince. And all those slowly start coming to light. Like, slowly, why is each different thing happening? How did he get on this path? And his past story is a lot more of him finding out a lot more about himself. Book two is a physical journey of discovery, as well as some more maturation because he's a young kid in the past. He has a lot of growing up to do. So he starts learning more about the ideas of what a hero really might be, as well as how a hero to some can be interpreted as a monster to others.
Right.
So we're going to continue building on that theme too, which is something I established in book one as well. Like, one person's hero can be another's monster.
Cool. That sounds. I can't wait to get there. Like I said, I'm halfway through book one, and I'm looking forward to continuing. Now, you also said that you're working on book three currently.
Yeah. So I've been doing notes and sort of pre-planning because I actually start officially July 1st. So while we're recording this, it's the 28th of June, so like 3 days. And I'm just trying to hammer out all the notes and everything I can so I can turn in a draft by, I think, February is the current like estimated deadline that they have for me. So
Wow.
that should be comfortably doable because this is the only epic fiction project I'm only working on. So.
Right. Okay. So, Doors of Midnight. What's the official release date for that?
In the U.S., August 13th, and then that's a Tuesday, and then whatever that same Thursday is in the U.K. because their release schedules are. I think they begin their sales cycles like on a Thursday in the U.K. and ours are on Tuesday because of for whatever reason the way they do the sales number aggregate counting is it starts on a Monday, but like if you launch a book Monday. Weirdly, sometimes pre-order sales will trigger on the Sunday before in some bookstores, and that counts as a previous week. So you might lose some sales if you're trying to hit a list with your publisher.
Interesting.
So if you launch on a Tuesday, some of your sales might count Monday. They'll trickle in, but Monday is still the start of that new sales cycle. And I don't know how the UK does it, but for whatever reason, again, there's just like that same Thursday.
Yeah, interesting. I knew that it was Tuesdays was Trad Pub release days, but I didn't realize that was the reason. But I guess that makes sense. Yeah, and then
it's for magazine lists.
Right. Cool. And then book three you're anticipating will be, kind of a 2-year gap.
Yeah. Summer 2026 is when they're aiming.
Okay.
Originally, these were supposed to be one a year. So book two was originally supposed to be out last October, but we ran into a lot of stuff. My original editor kind of vanished for 6 months, and then he was let go beginning of 2023. January or February, and then I had a period where I had no editor, so like I didn't get edits for nearly a year.
Okay.
So by the time like we actually got the edits and they were done, it was October. And I was like, yeah, this book should have been out already. Which sucks for me because I get paid my advance splits by release and turn-in dates and stuff, so like it kind of bunged me on money.
Yeah, right. That spreads out a little bit longer than you were anticipating, right?
Yeah. I turned 3 years into 6 to 7 because of the gaps. So.
Right. Wow. Okay. Interesting. Those are the things with TradPub that I don't usually get to hear because I talk to mostly indie authors, right? So yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, is there anything else you'd like readers to know going into either the first binding or the Doors of Midnight that maybe we haven't talked about yet?
Oh, that's a really good question. I I guess I hope like it drives curiosity, like be curious where the ideas and myths come from, because this is sort of reversing what I love doing, which is Googling and searching nonstop and reading texts and PhD papers on comparative mythology, because we're learning more and more constantly about the history of ourselves through storytelling and especially mythos. And I wrote this in a way I was hoping would prompt people Googling or using whatever materials they could to like learn about how similar so many stories are and myths and beats and tropes and archetypes. So I think it'll give them a cooler appreciation for us as a species, because that was sort of the idea in a love letter, and it's why it wasn't just set in India or like a fantasy India. Like there is a full Silk Road that our Ari sort of essentially navigates. I mean, the present day is set in a country that is an analog amalgamation of Italy, of Spain, and Portugal, because the Silk Road went through those places. I mean, the official end was Old Venezia, which was Venice.
Right.
A lot of cultures traded material on it. They traded stories. They traded so many things that historically we've always been super interconnected as people. There are records of Indo-Roman Parthian trade. So I'm hoping this sort of opens up a really cool dialogue of people learning where a lot of fantasy story ideas might originally come from, or who else has done them a long time ago, when, where, and how, and why. Because I think as fiction continues to diversify, we see more marginalized people come and writing stories. You might get a further appreciation for some of the storytelling techniques, styles, or even similar tropes, but done through a different lens you've never seen.
Right. Yeah, I absolutely love that, and I love that about the story. It's definitely a perspective that is not, common in popular fantasy literature. So I always love seeing things through another lens and getting, a wide breadth of different perspectives. So that's really cool. So, Ronnie, this is the greatest podcast in the multiverse. So it's time for the final question. Can you tell me how in a parallel universe a different decision might have affected another version of your life?
Ooh, if I had stuck with gaming as a kid, I probably would have pursued it and been a streamer instead of a writer, because I was gaming and competing back when Halo CE just started first having LAN tournaments, and then Halo 2 kicked off, obviously, the Xbox Live MLG circuits, and I was pretty seriously playing, and I didn't know at that time streaming was viable,
Right.
but if I had stuck with it, it could have been a thing, because that's when the early streamers were just doing YouTube tutorials, right? Like there was no actual like live stream, but they were dropping like, here's how you get like a 30 bomb in Halo, and here's how you do the super bounce. And they became the early proto streamers, because once live streaming was a thing, they already had these YouTube follower accounts, and they just migrated to Twitch and everything. And gaming was definitely still really impactful on me, and I still play. I'm just old now and have a slower millisecond response time. But I think there's a high possibility I would have pursued that, especially if I had known it was viable. But having Asian parents, I didn't think that. But that's probably the most likely. It's not what I would have wanted, but I think I would have chased it.
Yeah, for sure. That's cool to me. I mean, I'm a bit older than you. Before, when I was gaming in high school and that, I mean, online gaming wasn't even a thing, right? So like, I mean, I was like playing like Final Fantasy VII, and I mean,
oh wow, okay, yeah.
But I would have looked. I mean, I definitely had thought, if that was something that was there when I was a teenager, that is totally something a road I would have wanted to go down. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's really cool. I love that answer.
No, thank you.
Yeah, so thank you very much for joining me. Can you tell our listeners the best place to find you?
Yeah, so I'm active on Facebook as RR Virdi. Twitter is probably where I'm most engaged, also at RR Virdi. And then Instagram, I'm learning to do better, because I've realized what a great platform it is for interaction with people. And I just never knew that, and I kind of slept on it. And that's also another great place. I do respond pretty frequently on Twitter and Instagram especially. Those are the best places to find me.
Awesome. I'll be sure to link your profiles in the comments below. Yeah, thank you so much for joining me. This was great.
Yeah, likewise, man. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining me. If you enjoyed the show, like and subscribe on your favorite podcast app or on YouTube. You can find me on Facebook and Instagram at Greatest Podcast in the Multiverse. As well, you can help support the show by supporting me on Patreon. For as little as $5 a month, you can get early access to the show, as well as submit your questions for my upcoming guests. I hope to see you next time. Bye now.